It's almost Halloween, and if you've been around the channel long enough, you know I love Halloween, the season, everything about it, and especially all the horror media that comes out. And now I've only really talked about two types of horror media on the channel, and those are video games and movies. While I love both, it begs the question of whether horror movies or horror games are better. Now I know that most people would instantly go, psh, horror movies, obviously. But I think horror games have become so good in recent years that they may be the prime horror media. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Are horror movies that masterful medium that reigns supreme, or have horror games taken over as the new sultan of scares? More so than in almost any other genre, horror needs you to be immersed. If you're not immersed, you're not going to be scared, and the whole point of horror flops and stumbles over itself. Horror movies do a great job with this, typically opening with a big event that gives us major detail into either the killer or the main character that is hugely attention-grabbing. And then, afterwards, it pulls you back into that regular world to build on top of that going forward. A great example of that is the opening of Scream, which sets the subversive yet still scary tone of the movie up right from the get-go. The killer asks questions about horror movies over the phones, already being self-aware, but then the character we're following sees her boyfriend dead and then has killed herself, which is crazy because she was played by Drew Barrymore at the height of her popularity. Heck, she was all over the marketing, so seeing her die so early on is a great way for Wes Craven to essentially say, hey, this isn't your typical slasher. We know the rules and we plan to break them. Yet the immersion is so easy to break in movies that it's a tricky move to be able to pull it off. If the movie is poorly paced or the actors don't do a good job, it pulls you out of the movie relatively easily, and it's much harder to get re-immersed. However, video games on the other hand have a much stronger pull on their immersion by their very nature. You aren't allowed to just sit back and be a passive observer like in movies, because you're the player. You have to make those actions, and as such are more involved in whatever actions happen. Playing the game gets you pulled in more and more with what you're doing, and the game can respond with more scares as you move forward and through the scarier areas. Keeping the theme of subversive immersion with Scream, I think there's no finer example of a subversive horror game than Doki Doki Literature Club. Now, for those that don't know about this game, I know you're thinking I'm crazy. How could a cute anime-style visual novel be scary? Well, that's exactly the point. For the vast majority of the game, it seems like an entirely normal visual novel, and while there are a few odd lines of dialogue, these could just be chalked up to coincidence. However, when Sayori kills herself, not only does the story become incredibly dark, things devolve into full-on horror. The graphics start going crazy, characters act like bizarre versions of their previous selves, and with Monica, well, it's just Monica. Truly, I think Doki Doki Literature Club is one of my favorite horror games, if not just games in general, all just because of how it lulls you into a false sense of security about everything down to the genre of the game itself. And then right after Sayori confesses her love for you, it does a complete 180. But while video games are much more immersive from the get-go, the immersion breaks it can be even more detrimental than in movies. The most immersion-breaking moments in video games tend to come from either difficulty in the game or difficulty in the controls, and both just kill the tension you feel from the game. If the game gets too difficult and you just keep dying and dying, you go from scared to just annoyed, and it's hard to get back out of that mood. The other, and maybe even worse, is when the controls cause frustration. In a horror game, the controls need to feel like an extension of the player, because the less they understand the controls, the less they're fully focused on the game and it scares. Any good story needs to have good pacing, but horror stories definitely need it. Long stretches of nothingness or throwing all the scares into a small chunk of time just ruins it. The pacing of horror media can also help cement its success by balancing scares and suspense. This category is a much easier task for movies as they take up much less time overall. That doesn't mean that it's simple or that all horror movies nail it, plenty don't, but a prime example of one that does is the original Halloween. While so many other slashers would end up diluting its footsteps into the formula of big murderous cold open, the majority of the movie not much happens, and then everything getting resolved in the last 20 to 30 minutes. The original does it best. Halloween sets Michael Myers up as terrifying from the start, and in the slower times between scares and kills, he can commonly be seen watching and stalking the main cast of characters in a subtle but smart way to always keep the viewer ready and invested. Video games, on the other hand, have a much more difficult task of pacing with how horror games are longer than horror movies, but that's not to say it can't be done well. The Resident Evil 2 remake is a great example of that, with how Claire and Leon are centralized within Raccoon City, but most especially the police station, and have to escape. But since they stay in one large section the majority of the game, you as the player get to know the halls, the zombies, and start unlocking the areas that were originally impassable, delivering great pacing determined by the player. And just when you start to get too comfortable with your settings, that's when Mr. X comes after you and won't stop chasing you until you get got. Now, building off of the pacing, the actual length difference between movies and video games is huge. Movies are always going to be much more concise, and as such can more thoroughly tell a story from beginning to end, without padding being added to make it feel worth the viewer's time. On the other hand, horror games have no such boundaries. They can be shorter than a movie, roughly the same amount of time, or so much longer. Obviously, this can help make larger and more exciting stories, but it can also be a detriment to certain games if they go overboard on length. Being able to keep players scared and invested fully can be a difficult task for just a few hours, but as the game's length increases, so does the difficulty of this task. This isn't to say it's always bad, though, as psychological horror games thrive on this. The big sanity-breaking moments in eternal darkness only hit so hard due to how long you've been playing consistently and where your mind will be as reality seemingly starts to break around you. Even the fourth wall will come crashing down. If used correctly, the extra available time can help cement some killer video game experiences, but doesn't have the traditional safety net the movies do of having a standard range of time for how long you'll be watching. Whether it's horror movies or games, visuals are everything in delivering the scares. Doesn't matter if it's going for a subtle approach for tension or throwing jump scares in every other scene, the visuals need to be good. Yet this is an area where both movies and video games are on seemingly equal footing, with both having some incredible bonuses but also some very harsh negatives. Let's mix things up here and start with the games first, which have the difficult question of what to do with the camera. Do you allow it to be a free control camera? Fixed angles, limited control, different styles for different areas. Depending on the series, the game, or even just individual events, these questions always have to be considered in a way not needed by movies. See, there you have the director with their vision, and they know what you're going to see. With the games, a lot of times, the player has control of the camera, so outside of cutscenes, things can't be too drastic or experimental for changing of the angles. But for some games, the ability to move the camera isn't technologically possible to put in the game or would screw up the atmosphere of it. So, workarounds have to be made. That's how you get things like fixed camera angles in Silent Hill and Resident Evil, or the single-screen images in games like Five Nights at Freddy's. But with these limitations, developers have made iconic experiences around them in a way that would be panned in a movie. It really just comes down to how much control the players are allowed to have without being able to see and experience too much. Video games get the major plus of being able to create horrifying ideas in so many different art styles that are visually enticing and nearly impossible to do through movies. Well, there are plenty of realistic horror games, and they might not have always looked the best, and now go toe-to-toe with true horror movies themselves. Just look at the RE engine. I mean, come on. But realism isn't all that games are confined to, as they can experiment with tons of different ideas that are at home with the genre of games themselves. The aforementioned Doki Doki Literature Club really couldn't be told in any other way, as it draws so heavily from the visual novel genre. In fact, a way that it gets the player more scared is by having the characters actually move around or animate things with them, as it's so antithetical to the typical stock poses in visual novel games. Heck, you can even make 16-bit games become horrifying. Just take a look at the classic Sonic.exe. Yeah, it's not the most subtle, but with how iconic it is, clearly a lot of people got scared by it. Now, coming back to movies, they are certainly much more restricted visually. I'm not saying there aren't good animated horror movies. It's just much less common, and the ones that are there tend to be made tailored towards kids. But that doesn't necessarily discount them either. Coraline is friggin' great. However, since movies are all filmed and don't have to worry about player controls, they get to do whatever they want visually. The visuals are able to be expressed in tons of different ways by the director that can vastly change the entire vibe of the movie. Robert Eggers is a master of this in both The Witch and The Lighthouse, feeling different from any other movie I've seen, but also perfectly nailing the angle they're going for. Movies also get the benefit of using real actors, so unlike realistic video games, they don't fall into the heavy uncanny valley territory. And so while movies are stuck with the general realism in their portrayal, the visuals can be spiced up in a number of different ways. There's one thing people really associate the horror movies and games with, it's jump scares though. Now, I loved good jump scares from time to time too, but when they're the only form of scares and they're going all the time, it's just not good. It hits the point of diminishing returns. And all crappy jump scares always start out the same way. First, what the heck? There's something going on here. And that's basically how they always go. Inciting event, build up, tease, exploration, fake out, and then bam, jump scare. And it's always got the same stock sound effects, and really it's not scary, Everybody can see it coming. It's not good. So, yeah, this happens in both movies and games though, so I can't really give a disadvantage to either. They're both very guilty of this major problem. But a big factor in horror is how much those outside the horror sphere know, though, and that's when it comes to the icons. And I'm sorry, but video games have nothing on movies. Yeah, there's Pyramid Head, Slender Man, Mr. X, Nemesis, Freddy Fazbear, and not an insane amount more that are well known by many. However, with movies you got Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, Pinhead, The Invisible Man, Pennywise, Jigsaw, Annabelle, Chucky, Xenomorphs, and so many more. There's no real competition, but to be fair, movies have had a huge head start. It creates an interesting dynamic though, because since there aren't nearly as many major icons in gaming, there aren't as many series with endless amounts of sequels and reboots like there are in movies. This leads to more individualistic experiences being shared around in video games than with the many series with many sequels from movies. Well, now we're here at the end. It's time to answer the question, which is better, horror movies or horror games? Well, get ready to be disappointed because I'm going to go with the lukewarm answer of that they are both great. In all honesty, I just think that they both succeed in such great but different ways, it's hard to definitively say one is better than the other. Movies are better at delivering tighter and more focused narratives without having to worry about how it feels to play and if the player can understand it. But on the other hand, video games are better in delivering larger and more expansive stories, more deeply immersing the player, and being able to have horror in a much broader range of styles. Also, there's VR, which I really didn't talk about here, but from my experiences, it's definitely got potential to be a prime horror medium, but with where it is as a platform, it's just not quite ready yet. But who knows? Maybe in a few years, I'll be singing a different tune. So yeah, I think both horror movies and games are equally great, just in different ways. Thank you everyone for watching. I love the Halloween season, so I want to talk about some of my favorite media, some of my, horror. It's such a good genre. And this isn't the only Halloween-related video I'm going to have up on the channel, Check back in a few days for for a tasty new video, and that was an intentional word choice right there. But yeah, so I just wanted to, thank you. Leave a like if you enjoyed it. Please comment what horror stuff you like and what you like about Halloween. But I got some recommendations for you. This, with Halloween coming up, I think some great movies to watch are Original Halloween. That's a classic. Original Friday the 13th as well. That's probably the best of the series. The Witch and The Lighthouse, I mentioned those. Those are both such good movies. They're not as, flashy, jump scare. They're a lot more of a slow burn, a lot more introspective, but they're masterfully delivered. And then for the games aspect, obviously I'm going to shill Resident Evil. I love, the entire Resident Evil series. It's so friggin' fun. I think if you want a really scary one, I would say probably go with the 2 remake or 7. I feel like those are more scary. But again, Resident Evil 3 is just such a fun game to play. Physically, the gameplay is great. So you can't go wrong there. So, yeah. And, Doki Doki Literature Club, if you kind of like the big problem is to get people on board about that game, you have to spoil the twist. But the twist is part of the best part. But if you think you would enjoy it, you definitely probably would. It's one of those types of games where, if you're like, oh, I'm interested in this, you're going to like it. So, I got to throw that one out there. But yeah, thank you so much. I will see you guys in a few days with the new Halloween-related video. And until next time, goodbye.